The offense will unfold.
Okay, looking at the selector shaft, which is at the top of the gearbox, we have the yokes, and it's quite difficult to actually select the gear without selecting other ones with the casing off. However, I'm going to demonstrate the selector shaft and how it works. Alright, quite vital, and you understand how you select your gears from your gear stick that way. This is a principle that applies to quite a few gearboxes. We have our selector shaft here, and on the selector shaft we have pegs. Now these are actually quite vital to understanding how you select your gear, only one of them at a time. So there's one on the rear end here. This on the R380 will be for the reverse and the fifth, and this one is for the first, second, third and fourth. The LT77 has a very similar arrangement, except it has an extra lever for the reverse, and it utilises the same selector peg that it does for first, second, third and fourth. Only you have to push it over further and then engage. The first, second synchro hub actually has a spur gear teeth cut on it, and you're pushing this idler or intermediate gear into place. The LT77 doesn't have synchro mesh on reverse. Now if you see how this works here, you have a spool and you have slots in the selector yokes. You can see those quite clearly. When you move your gear stick backwards and forwards, or selecting a gear, what you're doing is you're actually selecting one of the slots in the yokes and moving it either backwards or forwards depending on what gear you get. Now you can see I've just pulled that into third and no other gears are selected. We also then need to pay attention to this interlock spool here. This is what stops the other yokes moving when you're selecting a certain gear. It's held in place with this, which you see clearly on your gearbox if you have a look at it, and looking on the inside you can see here. Alright, now there's two of those on the gearbox because there are two interlock spools. Pulling this out, you can see clearly what it is. Alright, looking back at the interlocking spool and the selector shaft with the pegs and the yokes, you can see there is actually a clear range that the operation will be, and to stop this going too far you have your spool retainer, okay, and this will only give it a certain range that it can move in. There is also an interlocking spool on the fifth gear and the reverse gear for the R380, or just for the fifth gear on the LT77, and that will also be held in place. Okay, so when you're moving your selector shaft, it will either be disengaged or holding another yoke, and the gear that's been selected will only be selected on the yoke with the peg that's in the right place. And I'm just pushed it out of third in this case. The centre support plate has detent balls and springs, and they locate in these slots here. So basically you can see them here. They're two detent balls, or plungers as we call them. You either have neutral or selected, either forwards or backwards gear. There is a lot more going on with the gear selection, and this involves the gear selection housing. And just to keep you on the edge of your seat, we'll cover this in another tutorial. It's actually quite lengthy, so it'd be best to do it in depth. We've already had a look at some of the differences between the two gearboxes, and what you've got to appreciate that this is actually a development rather than a completely new gearbox. LT77 centre plate has bearings in it for the lay shaft and the main shaft. In the casing you also have the bearing races, and these are shimmed up, or the infloat's taken out with shims underneath this cover plate here. Alright, so here are the spaces for the shims. Taking out the M float on the R380 gearbox, you put selective shims in the centre plate here. Big difference. The main shaft and lay shaft also have support bearings, you can see here, whereas in the LT77 housing there are no support bearings, you can see that here. And the casings, the rear casings are physically different. One is larger than the other because of the extra gear that's in that area. The splines on the output shafts, LT77 R380. LT77 has less, and we know the problems on these. And if you don't yet, we'll cover this in later tutorials on transfer boxes. Okay, what is actually vital that you realise that the LT77 is not just the LT77 gearbox. Through its history, and if we talk about the Land Rover history, we're talking from the D suffix all the way up to G and H. They are through constant development. Not all parts fit all gearboxes. Not all bearings will fit. The suffix on the end of the gearbox is vitally important to tell you which stage of the development of that gearbox it actually is. They didn't just put them in Land Rovers, they also put them in LDV vans and in taxis, and it was quite a commonly used gearbox at one time. The R380 as well has a two-wheeled drive version. So when you're looking on its development, which you're talking about J, K, L, etc., each one of these has their own idiosyncrasies. You're looking actually not just at an R380, you're looking at something which is like a J suffix, which would have been an early one, and it had its problems. You can look at either Paddock's website, and there's descriptions underneath the gearboxes which will give you information, or you can drop onto Ashcroft's website. They'll give you more detailed information. Check them out and have a look if you're curious.